Cultural change, 1290 to 1340. The age of the maturity of Dante and Giotto of circa 1290 to 1340 stands out as one of the greatest eras in the history of Italian culture. The story of literature and the arts at the time is the more remarkable in that previously the principal traditions of Italy's civilization had been found elsewhere. Italians had been famous for their trade and for their legal and medical studies. But despite the so-called Tuscan proto-Renaissance of the 12th century, and despite the cultivation of the Sicilian court of the early 13th century, Italy had conceded cultural preeminence to others in music, poetry, and the arts. In classical studies, philosophy, and theology, Germany and France were her masters. In the 12th century, Chrétien de Troyes could boast with justice that from Greece and Rome highest learning had passed to his own country. God grant that it may be maintained here, and that it may be cherished, so that the honor which has come with it may never part from France. God has bestowed it as another shares, but of Greeks or Romans no more at all is heard. Their fame has passed, and their living flame extinguished. Now suddenly, or so it seemed, this northern predominance was challenged. In the arts, the first signs of the resurgence appear in architecture. It was in these years that the four great cathedrals of central Italy were begun: Siena, Arezzo, Orvieto, and Florence. In every town saw the construction of new churches for the friars, and private and public palaces acquired a scale of magnificence hitherto unknown. These buildings, important in their own right, also provided the indispensable settings for painting and sculpture, which at this period were much more closely linked to architecture than they are today. The rise of fresco painting in the early 14th century, for instance, was in large measure a result of the extraordinary number of churches being built. In Tuscany, very few altarpieces are recorded before 1300, and there is no record at all of any comprehensive fresco sequences. Their emergence at this time was the result of the new pressure of demand for church decoration. When so many churches were being put up, the old mosaic works were considered too expensive and too slow in the making, and frescoes increasingly took their place. At the same time, a profound change came about in the character of art. The hierarchic Romanesque and Italo-Byzantine schools, dedicated to the symbolic expressions of a divine truth, were slowly being supplanted by artists who sought a new naturalism and the telling of a human story. In the first place, this development can be related to the influence of Northern Gothic art. In the sculpture of the 12th and early 13th century, the Halberstadt, Freiburg, Amiens, Chartreuse, and Reims can be seen plastic and three-dimensional expression movements. From the abstract and general to the concrete and particular, interest in men and humanization of religion, all these appear now, some 50 to 100 years later. In Italian art, undoubtedly much of this new art was a response to northern work studied either on visits to France, Germany, or through manuscript and illuminations and sketchbooks brought to Italy. Gothic influence did not stand alone, however, but combined with what was in many ways a similar stylistic current from the south. In southern Italy, during the first half of the 13th century, Frederick II, wonder of the world and wondrous innovator, had united in his person the kinship of Sicily and Naples, and the dignity of Roman emperor. Artists at his court had flattered the imperial dreams of their master by re-evocation of the classical ideas ideals of the early Roman imperial world. Frederick's gold coined medals and Augustine stels have been so called. The representation of the head of Augustus upon them and the statuary for his Capuan gate had been a conscious attempt to inspire an imperial renaissance. This too stimulated the new art. From this time, artists within Italy began to seek inspiration in the reliquies of the classical world, which were still found in profusion in its towns. First of these was Nicola Pisano, who had passed his early life in the southern kingdom and in whose work was classical influences were particularly strong. For instance, in sculpting the Adoration of the Magi in his pulpit for the Pisan baptistry, he drew upon the motifs of a 2nd century Roman sarcophagus decorated with the story of Phaedra and Hippolytus. From sources such as these, Nicola, with his son Giovanni and his pupil Arnolfino Cambio, brought to sculpture a new weight and dignity of representation. Representation, especially in the portrayal of the human figure. Soon these developments were adapted to other media, with a series of mosaics executed at Rome or shortly before the 1290s. Pietro Cavallini and Jacopo Torriti introduced a new plasticity. Ugh. I'm so sorry, guys. Okay. Into two-dimensional representation. Here the influence of the Pisani were reinforced by the inspiration of the early Christianity, of the art of early Christianity, the works of the 4th and 5th centuries, which Cavallini had studied in the churches in the Laterane and Santa Costanza. From Rome, the style passed a few years later. Assisi in the Upper Church of San Francisco, where Cimabue and Tortilla worked in fresco, the manner attained real maturity in the legend of St. Francis. In this work cycle, life-sized, volumetric human figures expressing human emotions made their first appearance in European. Oh boy, the shade is killing me today, guys. I'm sorry about that. Whether this be so or not, it is Giotto di Bondone who henceforth dominated the art of central Italy. His hold upon tactical values, his sense that is of a third dimension, his feeling for movement and life, and what Brinson has called his dominion over significant gave him preeminent place in the art of the age and in the history of art. In the frescoes of Scrovegni Chapel at Padua and in Santa Croce at Florence, Giotto evoked a whole new range of feeling and expression. It was with justice that by the end of the 14th century, he should have been acknowledged everywhere as the key figure in the establishment of the new art. His immediate followers at Florence, Bernardo Taddeo Gaddi and Maso di Bianco, for all their narrative invention and human intimacy, were dwarfed by his genius. But at Siena, the school of Duccio de Buonsienga developed its own more lyrical and illustrative style with jewel-like coloring and linear grace. Giotto had given painted figures humanity. Duccio established them in recognizable settings. Simone Martini invested them with poetry, while Ambrogio Lorenzetti set them in their complete physical environment. It was at this time that Florence and Siena produced the first tentative beginnings of portraiture and of landscape in painting. Contemporaneously, outside Tuscany, one finds the beginnings of the Renaissance school, the tradition of manuscript illumination at Bologna, and the first modifications of Byzantine influence at Venice with the work of Paolo Veneziano. Before Giotto, painters had drawn inspiration from sculptors. In Giotto's own generation, sculptors were to seek their models in painting. Andrea Pisano executed reliefs for the Campanile of Florence, imbued by the Giotesque sense of the human and three-dimensional, while the Pisan Giovanni de Balduccio took the same manner to Milan. Tino di Cimeno, after working in Tuscany, passed to Naples, where his two monuments for the Angevin court were clearly influenced by the linear Gothic and Simone Martini. So, too, was the school of the Sienese goldsmiths, which first made its appearance with Guccio de Maniena. Works in precious metals are more vulnerable to time than those in stone or paint, but from what it survives, it is easy to understand their Italian and European reputation. The development of literature in this period parallels to a certain degree of the changes in art. Just as before the second half of the 13th century, Italy had enjoyed no strong native tradition in painting and sculpture. So in literature, she had not even formed the wide variety of her dialects and Italian literary language. In a sense, this situation was to endure throughout our period. In Italian prose, language was to be the creation of the 19th century. Yet what is significant here is that until the 1290s, no Italian vernacular dialect was, yet considered the equal of non-Italian tongues for literary expression. It is true that at the courts of the Hohenstaufen in southern Italy, poets of the Sicilian school had written in their native language and were followed in this by writers in mid-century Tuscany and Bologna. But in many places, in almost all of northern Italy, Italian dialects were still fighting for equal consideration as literary languages, with Provençal and Northern French. In the feudal courts of the age at Genoa and Venice, the language of lyric poetry was not Italian but Provençal, and the most powerful Italian poets of the 13th century were men who wrote in the language Uyo de San Cirque of Treviso, Bartolomeo Zorzi of Venice, and Sordello of Mantua. Other writers looked to French, or rather to the French-Italian hybrid, which was accepted as the current literary speech of Lombardy. In this tongue, men related anew the epics of the Maître de Bretagne, the legends of around the Tristan story, and the Maître de France, the tales of Charlemagne. This Franco-Italian was strongly entrenched too as the language of prose. As late as the last years of the century, Rusticchio de Pazza had employed it to take down the narrative of Marco Polo in the prisons of Genoa. Brunotto Latini delivered his Livre du Trésor in the language he explained, and his words were echoed by many other Italians of the age. Pour ce qui la parle et plus delectable et plus commun à toutes gens. All this changed with the 14th century. The spite of the New Age is expressed by Brunotto's pupil, Dante, who complained of those wicked men in Italy who praised the common speech of other nations, and despite their own, everywhere in the verse if not prose. The Tuscan dialect came to be accepted as the common literary language of the whole peninsula. The various improbable attempts at sociological explanation of this phenomenon may be set aside. The true causes are first, as Dante argued in the De Vogue Eloquentia, that it was the best adapted to poetry, and second, that it was Tuscan poets who first made their contributions to Italian vernacular writing. At the same time, the use of vernacular tongue grew in prose. Here again, Tuscan was predominant in the quality and quantity of work produced. Through it was still only rare that non-Tuscans wrote in Tuscan for prose as they did for verse. This development did not inhibit the study of Latin, and this era saw the first beginnings of Italian humanism at Padua, Bologna, and Florence. That study language combined with the passion for antiquity, which was to color all Italian culture in the following generation. While the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries saw the first triumphant affirmation of Tuscan and other Italian dialects as literary languages, so too did it produce a literature of an hitherto unknown richness and variety, and a wholly new sense of reality and individuality. Here again, French influence was strong formative force. The worldly lyric refinement of the language d'oc and the naturalistic and vigorous courtly epics and fabulots of the language de Royal were absorbed slowly first at the court of Frederick II, and then in the more down-to-earth world of central Italy, until they had coalesced with a native tradition of formal rhetorical study to produce the first Tuscan poetry. In the works of Lapo, Gianni Siena, Cino di Pistoia, Gieda Cavalcanti, I'm sorry if I mispronounced, and their followers, the Florentine Dolce, still Nuovo, attained a previously unexplored refinement and psychological insight in a more robust tradition. The realist displayed a powerful directness and raciness of speech, which culminated in Cecco and Galori's Oedipal, half enraged, half humorous sonnets against his father and against life. Midway between these two schools came to the worldly romanticism of Fogori di San Gimignano and the burning religious passion of Fra Jacobin of Todi. Above all, spanning these traditions and yet alone in his genius, was the well-nigh incomprehensible miracle of Dante Alighieri, the poet of the medieval world. In both literature and art, the styles which emerged at the end of the 13th century had a long prehistory, which, taken with the individual genius of those who worked in them, can do much to explain, insofar as it can be explained, the character of its leading works. Yet the new enthusiasm for culture, and even in some respects the forms that culture took, can be related in a general sense to conditions in society. Why should Italy, a country which had been, comparatively speaking, inferior in the arts, now come to be their principal homeland? Is there anything outside purely stylistic influences which can explain the decline of symbolism and the rise of more naturalistic forms? Any answers to these questions are likely to be partial, oblique, and tentative, but in the hope of discovering them, we shall consider the land, economy, and society in which Giotto, Dante, and their contemporaries lived and worked, their religious and intellectual ideas of their age, and finally government, protection, and patronage of the arts. This will be the end of this excerpt from High Renaissance art. Thank you.